thank you, Andy and Chris, for making the time. And yeah, for those of you watching at home, the idea is to keep it pretty informal. We've discussed a little bit with Andy and Chris. We've jammed on things that could be interesting to talk about, and I'm gonna be kind of MC trying to walk us through that. But if you have any questions, things that we want to cover, follow-ups to things that Andy and Chris say, like, please do not hesitate to put in the chat. We want to make it a bit interactive, so you can use the Q&A section for that, and I will free them from the overhead of looking at that. Myself and Adam will be looking at that, and Andy and Chris will like raise them if needed. So we were chatting before. One of the things that we talked about, even before jumping into actually like board meeting and structure, timeline, we're gonna get very tactical because I think that's where the best value or advice resides. But one of the things we talked about is how important it is to know your board members. So I'm gonna start with you, Andy, and hear your take of how important it is to know your board members' passions and interests and ways of working as you are preparing board meeting and approaching how to do it.
Thanks, Albert. Yeah, so I think this is critical. Getting to know your board as a finance leader is super important, and it's a very important relationship that you will have. Obviously, like, your number one person internally is your CEO, but the board is probably next to them in terms of understanding like how well you're performing, and fostering that relationship is very important. And getting to know them can help you make better board meetings, right? Because if you understand, these are the Series D investors, I know what questions they were asking during our fundraise and what things they're going to care about. And before a board meeting, I always ask each of them what are topics they want us to discuss, and then you can really cater the content of the board meeting towards the topics that are most top of mind for your board members. And a lot of this is like, if you know your audience, you can create a better meeting, better materials to cater to their wants and needs. So I think it's super critical. I try to ask for topics in advance. I also try to do a financial review with each of them prior to the board meeting. So it's important to get time with them and help them understand the materials, make sure they're prepared for the board meeting. And all of this will lead to you having like better and better board meetings and a better relationship with the board over time.
Yes. Yeah, and Chris, like before asking for your takes, I think one thing that comes to mind here, we have in the audience, a mix between CFOs all the way to FP&A finance analysts. So one thing that comes to mind is, yeah, if you are an analyst, maybe you don't have the direct relationship that you have with your board that Andy has, but like you should ask those questions, and like those are the questions that will make you prepare better slides or contribute from your role and your part in it. Chris, I think like you will agree with Andy's take, but like, yeah, anything to add, or how would you do it differently? How you do it differently at Postscript?
Yeah, definitely agree with Andy. I think it's really important to know your board members, just like it's important to know your stakeholders internally, right? One of the things you can do at all levels of your FP&A career is, try and learn more about what the cadence of the board meeting is like. And so maybe that's talking to your CFO or your finance leader to get a digest of how the meeting went. But even beyond kind of the internal workings of the board meeting, you can also learn about who makes up your board externally too. So it's things like, looking at the websites of the VCs that make up your board seats. You may even find that the individual board members may have blogs or may post on LinkedIn or Twitter, or whatever space they may go to. It's a great place to kind of learn like what's on their mind, how are they talking about the companies in your space or the companies they invest in, and you can really glean a lot about their kind of thought process and use that to shape how you're building the narrative for the board meeting.
Nice, makes sense. Yeah, you were mentioning before when we were chatting, even like the type of metrics that they care about when analyzing companies in your industry, right?
Yep, exactly.
Nice. And then let's go back to you, Andy. And again, you talked about knowing them, you talk about talking to them. Can you give the audience here roughly how many touch points do you have with board members like every quarter outside of the board meeting itself? And like, yeah.
So I always have a minimum of one with the board meeting, with the board members outside of the board meeting. and that's typically 2 weeks in advance of the board meeting. My team and I, we make our financial, just a financial results deck that will be a portion of the board deck, and I'll get time to walk them through that. This achieves a couple things. One, extra touch point with the board member. Two, we get them to actually engage with the materials. So you're talking about, trends in CAC and ARR waterfall and, whatever are the KPIs of your business. You get them to engage with that, and that will then actually like solicit even more information from them, because they might say, oh, wow, I actually didn't realize this like SMB segment was behaving this way. Like, we should spend more time on this in the board meeting. So I can ask them a month in advance and say, hey, what topics do you think are important? And they might say, oh, like, how are we scaling SDRs, right? But then once you go through the materials, they're like, oh, actually, like, this is clearly more important. We should spend some more time there. And then this gives me like another iteration to go with, in the final 2 weeks of board prep, to work with our executive team or whoever's presenting in that board meeting, to like tighten up the materials on those concerns. Then I'd say, sporadically there are other opportunities for engagement with the board. Occasionally I'll have a board member ask me for a favor. If a board member asks you for a favor, generally deliver on that. Other times, we'll do like dinners after board meetings, which I think are very important to do. If your company does in-person board meetings, try to make sure that you get that scheduled afterwards, because that also gives you another chance to spend time with them in a little more of an informal setting. So some of them will just come organically. Some of them we try to schedule, but generally board members are pretty busy. So, they are, both like looking for new deals or working on other companies, sitting on other boards. So, it's good to take those opportunities when you get them.
You were mentioning, Andy, 2 weeks before the board meeting, and I think like I saw Adam there send a question for the audience as well. That would be a good icebreaker to the next topic. That is, tell me about the cadence. You have quarterly board meetings. When do they happen? How many weeks after the end of the quarter? You say that 2 weeks before you send. Like, walk me through a timeline, and then we will compare with like Chris' experience as well.
Yeah, we're typically doing about like 4 weeks after quarter ends is when we do our board meeting. Usually that allows, I want to have about 2 weeks for us to do our accounting close, so that we can actually have like final numbers for the quarter, and then make sure we have enough time to get the deck together based on that information. The bigger your board gets, the more challenging scheduling becomes. So sometimes that may end up be 5 weeks, etc. And you have sort of a mess of EAs working with one another to get that scheduled. But yeah, I just want to make sure there's enough time for us to have final numbers on the quarter, and then give us time to prep.
Chris, similar timeline, faster, slower?
Yeah, we do pretty similar. It takes us about a week to close the books, and then another week to finish up the reporting and things like that. We like doing week 4 because that gives us time to kind of package up a pre-read and all the slides and things for the board meeting ahead of time. That gives us our like first sort of like group touch point with the board, where they can read through the things we want them to experience before the board. They can leave comments, gives us time to help respond and help add additional slides or additional narrative if we need to. So yeah, we try and get everything done by the end of week 3, and then have the board meeting towards the end of week 4 after they've had time to review and comment on any materials.
Nice, makes sense. And yeah, going back to my consulting days, I think we always had this saying with like big meetings with bigger stakeholders of a lot of the meetings should actually happen before the meeting, because you just don't have enough time to maneuver and like go and do additional deep dives. So I think like something that you both are saying is those 2 weeks before the meeting sort of touch points are key to know where to go deeper and where to spend those last 2 weeks that you have, right? In terms of like agenda, one of the things that we discussed, and maybe Andy, you touched on the financials 2 weeks before, so I would start with you, Chris, on what are the things that you send in advance and get discussed more rarely, versus what are the things that you actually like, put as the big agenda items for the meeting itself?
Yeah, so we have a pretty standard format that we follow each quarter. We'll evolve it and morph it depending on what the context is needed, but like the skeleton's all still there, right? It keeps the board members familiar with how we're going to walk through everything. And so ahead of time, we'll send out the slides from the deck that we're going to use to like guide the conversation during the meeting. We also send out a like Google Doc format pre-read that has each exec members like department review for the quarter. And these are like, half a page to a page for each exec leader. So they're not super in depth, but it just talks about like what are some wins we had for the quarter, what were some lowlights that we want to talk about in the meeting, and then any of the key metrics that may be relevant for that department. And so having that all packaged up means that there's like, 20 to 25 minutes of reading across all the departments where you can get the individual line item details of each department. And then the packaged up slides really help shape what the actual like story of the board meeting is, from like the results to the product roadmap for upcoming, to any one-off topics at the end of it.
So saying it back to you and going deeper, whereas you had say is there's a department update that happens in a Google Doc, lets them, explain themselves a bit more than like a slide. And then you have the slide deck that you might, go through in the meeting. And within that slide deck, how much of that is, there's a slide with our revenue and how it grew over time, and how much is it like a ad hoc storyline of what's top of mind, what you got from people in that like executive review 2 weeks before that was important. Like, is it like 80-20 towards ad hoc, or how would you say it's structured?
Yeah, I think of it sort of like almost like episodic TV shows, right? Like the formula is going to be the same. There's going to be an intro, there's going to be the financial presentation, there's going to be the roadmap presentation, and then there's going to be a conclusion, which is the discussion topics we want to talk about. But in between those sort of like key highlights, you might change things here and there, right? Like we're always going to show a P&L comparison versus budget, right? We're always going to show our cash runway and cash flow slide to show how much time we've got left until our next fundraising event. But what you may need to underline for those is if your revenue misses on a certain product line, you might want another slide that explains the delta there. Or if your revenue beat or your bookings beat, you might want to share a slide highlighting how we got to that beat, celebrate the wins kind of thing. And so you really can kind of craft what those individual like interconnecting slides are between the big story beats, so that it shapes to like what actually happened in the past quarter and what you want to focus on for the upcoming quarter.
Makes sense. And I'll go to you, Andy, in a second to compare and contrast versus your experience. But one of the things that we talked about, Chris, is like ownership of putting together this narrative and this deck. Can you talk a little bit about, what part does finance own, or what part do you own versus offload to different department heads, your CEO, and other people within the org?
Yeah, we have a technical CEO, and so it is mostly me and the CEO that are putting together the narrative as a whole, as well as our product leader. That sort of gets the key story beats of the company, right? How do we perform financially? What's the roadmap look like? What are we doing from the development side of things? We will bring in, like the go-to-market leaders, of course, if we want to talk about how bookings went for the quarter to help us get those key story beats. But I can generally captain all those things one-on-one with the go-to-market leaders. Or if we have, if we had a big headcount growth target for the quarter, I'll work with our people leader to talk about how that went. And then I think keeping the sort of like the board deck committee, I guess, pretty small helps us be a lot more nimble and take a lot less time to prep the board materials.
Nice. Yeah, the fewer cooks in the kitchen, the easier it will be. Andy, what is similar? What is different from you and your experience?
For me, the ownership falls on finance. I think finance, a key part of finance, especially as you get bigger, is investor relations. And I think this is one of the most important ways that you will engage with the board on a consistent basis. So when I think about ownership, for me, when I think about creating the board materials in my role, I kind of think of it like a movie producer. Like I am responsible for producing 4 great meetings per year. I have to understand like what's the story, how are we trying to communicate that to the board, what are we going to use to like give them enough insight and understanding of what's going on within the business, such that, you know, this is where knowing your audience is important too. So like, how do you convey that message to the folks on the board? And then to this point of like, who should be involved, get the best people you have on the team, right? So, you know, for any board meeting, we know the story. Like, let's say you launch a new product, you know, you're going to feature the product team and you're going to cover what happened with the product launch. But let's say the product team, you know, usually product teams are good at making slides, but let's say this product team is not very good at making slides. But you have a chief of staff who worked for 4 years at Bain. Get them on the team, recruit them to join and help you make some slides. So I think this is like, you know, assemble the right folks internally that can help you make high quality informational content, and then also the people that are responsible for the story. So I think it's important to get the right people involved. And then in terms of agenda, pretty similar to what Chris said, you know, we're always gonna have a CEO update. If we have new execs who join the team, I generally like to have them featured in the board meeting right after they join, assuming they've been in seat for at least a couple months, where they can, you know, give the board an update like, hey, you know, I just joined the customer success team. This is what I've seen is working well. This is what isn't working well. This is what I'm going to be doing in the next 2 quarters. One, it gives them an opportunity to meet the board. It also gives them an opportunity to kind of understand how the board is thinking about the business, and sort of increases their like ownership of what's going on. And then similar to Chris, you know, what are the big topics at hand? You know, are we thinking about doing some kind of M&A deal? Are we thinking about entering a new vertical? Do we have big changes to the product roadmap? And I'll usually make those like 45-minute session. And if you know your audience, you'll know that some of them will be for or against this. And those typically make really good discussion topics, because there'll be diversity of opinion in the room, and you know, people will debate a topic, and that usually leads to much better board meetings.
And in your case, do you send the entire deck ahead of time for review, or is it like mostly the financials that you mentioned that you cover a couple of weeks prior?
Yeah, so I'll send the financials a couple of weeks prior, and we'll cover that in advance. So then I actually sort of demote the financial section of the board meeting to spend more time on some of these things like go-to-market and product and these big discussion topics, because we'll have already covered the financials in detail. We will send the full board deck at least a couple days in advance, you know, depending how well we're able to get everything complete beforehand. Sometimes that's a challenge. I've generally seen that, you know, a lot of times board members don't really open it until the night before. So, you know, people will get the homework in right beforehand. So occasionally there's a couple times where we did get it done in advance. It's like, awesome, you know, just waiting for the comments to come in, and then nothing came in until the night before. So, yeah, you can put a lot of pressure on yourself to get it done. It's like, just make sure you get it done and out to them at least, you know, 24, 48 hours in advance. Sooner the better, but depends. You know, they may not engage with it until right before.
I will decline to comment on that, because we have some board members here in the audience of LF. So like, you know, they're all great, and they always look at the materials ahead of time. Chris, in your case, is it also similar, kind of like couple days before, but you know, not a big deal, or do you hold yourself to more stricter deadlines? And it's an important part.
Yeah, we've done
63% of the audience says days prior. So, you know, 63% of the audience is like on the not too much in advance camp, at least.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance, right? You gotta start getting it with people enough time so that people can digest the materials. But if you send too far in advance, then it won't be fresh for the meeting, or they'll forget about it for the meeting. So yeah, we try to stick to sending it the same week as the board meeting. Usually our board meetings are Thursday or Friday, so we'll send on Monday or Tuesday, about 72 hours before the meeting. We've done a pretty good job working with our board members to set up sort of that cadence so that they can respond and interact with the pre-read materials. I think, you know, we do all of our, not all except for one, so 3 out of 4 board meetings each year are remote instead of in person. And so that cadence really helps us keep engagement up and like make sure that we're not having people sit in Zoom meetings for 4 hours. So yeah, that really helps a lot.
Nice. And one one final thought on this like structure and so on. And I'm throwing a curveball at you because we haven't discussed this. So if you don't have any great ideas, we can skip. But any of your takes in terms of agenda, pre-read structure that you consider are particularly contrarian? I do think, Andy, you have one there of like, don't review financials on the board meeting. Again, I hear you, and it sounds very reasonable. And we do review financials in the board meeting, but like we rarely cover them like properly. So maybe that I will pick up myself. But yeah, any other more contrarian takes that you think you have there?
Yeah, maybe I'll just double down on the less of finance as a feature story. If something extreme happens, I think they'll probably want to discuss as a board, like let's say miss the plan by a lot, but that could also then really be on the go-to-market section, right? Of like, hey, why did we miss our top line forecast in the quarter? What I want to avoid is debating like why did gross margins move up or down by 60 basis points. It's like a waste of time for that group of people to spend 10% of that board meeting where we can be like aligning on product vision, figuring out how we're gonna get our next $50 million of ARR, to be debating the definition of EBITDA or what are these things, because you can do that initially. You can answer their questions in advance, and if some of those things continue to be issues, you can discuss them at the board meeting. But I think it saves a lot of time and allows to have a more like fruitful discussions about things that are very important to how you're actually going to grow the business.
Chris, what's your contrarian take?
Yeah, mine's actually not that much different from that. I would say I spend less than 3 minutes in the board meeting talking about the actual financial statements and like performance versus budget. It should be in the pre-read. It should be clear, and the explanations should be able to be understood, like just by reading about it. And then you spend the time in the board meeting talking about what the numbers mean, right? And so, I think setting the right like variance threshold so that like what's material and what's not is great. But even at the same time, like, instead of talking about, for example, Andy's example on margin, instead of talking about margin missed by 50 bips this quarter, we can say things like, we noticed a shift in, for us, it's like how customers are sending messages. And so they're sending lower margin messages because they're more efficient or something like that. Then we can take that and really talk about what strategy and what actions we need to take going forward versus just talking about what the difference in the numbers is.
Makes sense. And I do wonder, I think like I share and I echo that sentiment. I do wonder where we are part of a, fast growing early stage companies for which, we're maybe not optimized. When we don't center our board meetings around like net income necessarily. And I wonder, and if anyone in the audience has, again, different type of businesses at different scale, I do wonder whether, that becomes a more important part of the board meeting eventually.
Yeah, very true. If you're a private equity backed company on this call, your board meeting is probably experience very different than what I've described. And they're probably going to spend a lot of time talking about, they're going to want to know like all of the trends and in costs and EBITDA and margin. And they're probably thinking about exiting the business and, probably counted in quarters. And they're very sensitive to exactly what the performance is looking like.
For sure. We had a question there in the audience earlier as we were talking about structures of where would anyone be willing to show what the structure of a board deck skeleton looks like. I know if you have anything handy, we can also like share like after if one of you is willing to share again the agenda slide or something along those lines. I see.
Yeah,
Chris is looking dry.
I can get something to share. I think we might need to clean up a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah. Like, please don't share any confidential information. But other than that, I think it would be. And then we have another, very precise question here from Anthony that I think like roughly would be interesting of, what's the number of slides roughly of your board meeting? Are we talking about 10 slides? Are we talking about 100 slides? Somewhere in between? And then Chris put in the chat here the agenda, or he's about to put it.
Didn't let me line break. Yeah, our decks are, it really depends on what's going on, right? I would say our decks tend to be between 15 and 20 slides. The financial section itself is usually 4 or 5 slides, and the rest of it just depends on how much detail we want to get in with our product roadmap. And so if we're doing something that's like really novel and new, we want to show a lot of wireframes or walk them through the user experience, it might take a couple more slides to do that. But I would say that, like, keeping especially for finance slides, because it's very numbers dense, keeping them simple and to the point so that you're not spending 12 slides trying to explain something that you should be able to communicate much more quickly.
Our decks are much longer than Chris's. So I'd say the length of your deck is going to depend on a few things. One, how much action there was in novel areas, what's being presented, and how much sort of context you need to provide. If you have a topic to discuss that's around, should we, use M&A to like enter a new vertical, and you might need to like give the board a lot of background. They might not really understand that vertical, right? I think a lot of times you being in the company, you're living and breathing your company and your industry every day. And you forget that these members on your board, they might be on 10 boards, and they're like zooming into this company, and then they're flying to, somewhere across the world to try to close a deal. Like, they might not be thinking about your business all that frequently. So you got to make sure you give them enough context on like what's going on. Also will depend on your CEO, right? There can be times where, your CEO might be like, we have to go super deep in this, and one of your teams might create some of the content. They go, oh no, you need more, like double, triple click on this. We need 4 more slides. So different folks that are sort of like stakeholders in this can drive the length. But yeah, I mean, right now, we're probably at like 50 or 60 slides, and then we have an appendix where I usually throw the finance section. So I'm ashamed to admit that we've had some board decks that are over 100 slides, which is painful for us on the creation, but the board does appreciate the level of depth that we get into, and they generally feel like they have a really good grasp of what's going on. That being said, I also came from Square, and our board decks were massive. So I think this can range different places. I'm jealous of Chris, and the lean board deck. It definitely will reduce the burden on the company and the finance team to get it prepared.
Yeah, we have the pre-reads that go along with it too. And so you put a lot of that information off to the side in a Word format, and you can do something in 6 or 7 pages that would have taken 25 slides. And so that helps us keep the board deck really focused around just leading the actual live conversation. And so our appendix is actually pretty minimal there as well.
Nice. I like that split of like, slides versus Word, because I feel like especially what I find when I put together our own board meetings with the team is that all of the appendix starts to get very heavy on the slides, and you want to write a lot of things because you won't cover and you won't discuss it live. So I think that's where I like, Chris, your take on using the Word doc as a way to be more, prose heavy in some way, and like having it be more self-explanatory in some way.
Yeah, in finance sections, I also usually like to share like trended data. So I try to like show like, this is like this same metric over the last like 8 quarters. And then if you want to make like, pretty charts, generally that will like increase the length. So you may have some less like text dense slides and more like, hey, here's this like key metric that we're following. Here's like a little takeaway. This is what's happened over time. Because I think if you show like point in time stuff, you'll just end up getting questions from the board that's like, hey, like what did this look like before? Where should it be? So I generally like to show nice trended charts.
Nice. And I promise we didn't see this question, but we have someone ask, and I will let you, Chris, maybe answer first. how do you use LF to help streamline board deck preparation and reporting? And this is from Kaylee, who doesn't work at LF, by the way, right? So, this is not a seeded question.
No, it's great. I love it. Yeah, we've got a lot of things connected in LF, so we can essentially get all of our data sources all, structured together. And so kind of how we talked about like ad hoc versus what's structured, we know like the key metrics that we're going to show trended over time each board meeting. We know what our like standard like P&L view for the board deck looks like. We know what our headcount view for the board deck looks like. And so we have all those set up to just really auto refresh with LF. Which is, I mean, it's great. It's especially great when like things change with your tech stack. We just went through a migration from QuickBooks Online to Rillet, and we were able to keep that entire board structure and our monthly reporting cadence the same and just reconnect it through LF. So we didn't have to go rebuild a bunch of reports and stuff. But it essentially means that once we're done with accounting close and FP&A close, the actual like skeleton of the deck is basically already there. We just double check it, triple check it, make sure the numbers are right. And then we can use LF to dig in and double click on some of the metrics. And so, if we need to build some of those tier 2 metrics to support the narrative, it's very easy to like kind of drill into how we can put those together.
Nice. And
Yeah.
I want to dig into those metrics then, Chris, but Andy, on your end, I know use a lot of like HubSpot and like pipeline data with LF, right? Like that's one of
for us, everything LF, all reporting goes through LF. I think there was a little bit where my team was getting frustrated because I was just like this in LF, but now we're at the point where basically like all of our reporting comes through LF, so it really makes board prep a lot simpler. There's a little bit of work on the front end, but the amount of time you save is many multiples of any time you spend getting LF set up. So pipeline reporting, ARR reporting, P&L, headcount, churn, any of these things all come through LF, right? Now you get like, just like Chris said, okay, accounting close is done, hit refresh on all of our like NetSuite, get the P&L updated. We already have the ARR updated because we knew that at the end of the month, also updated through LF, through our CRM with HubSpot. And now like, boom, we're just like producing slides, refreshing our Google Slides that are connected to the data. So for us, I know LF has been a game changer in terms of time saving and being able to have, a relatively lean finance team that can produce, 100 slide decks.
Mm-hmm. So, works the same way for 100 slide deck and for the lean version. And we actually discussed having like a Google Doc add-in. So maybe that's next for you, Chris, for your Google Doc as well. And you were touching on something, Chris, that I want to double click on. And by the way, I see a lot of questions starting to come in from the audience. So I have like 1-2 more questions, and then I want to open it up mostly for audience questions. But you were talking about these tier 1 metrics that you always have versus some like tier 2. What's something that you notice, you started giving more importance to, or like a new metric that you weren't tracking? I know, Andy, then I would like let you answer the same question. You have some on the AI side, which I think is like new for all of us. But yeah, any metric, Chris, that you introduced lately that maybe weren't part of your tier 1 before?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there was anything net new. We've launched a couple new products this year, and so introducing like subgroups of ARR so that we can really pare back into performance of like, how has our core product grown? How have new products grown? And then they want to see more in depth on those newer products too, like user adoption, or like we have a new AI feature that automates like message copy, and so it's like attach rate on messaging volume kind of things. And so it's sort of just like feeling out where the business is going and what's important to the board meetings. But that's where to, getting to know your board members and following along with what they're talking about too helps a lot. I read a blog the other day about an investor who really liked to look at EBIT CAC, which is a completely made up metrics, but it's like your earnings before your CAC spend, and it shows kind of the efficiency of the business when you're not plowing a bunch of money into acquiring customers, right? And so if you find a blog from one of your board members about a new metric, you can take that, understand what they're looking for with that, and either adopt that metric or make sure you're speaking to similar things with using a new metric in the board presentation.
Nice, that's great. If you find the blog post, we can like then share it with the audience later. Andy, anything on your end? Any new metrics that you've introduced or that you've given more importance that you had before?
Yeah, so in our business, we intake a lot of documents, legal documents, and then our output is actually like a piece of work of a summarization of all of the documents we take in legal prose that we give to law firms we work with. So gross margin has been a topic for us for a while, and people do want to get that like double click or triple click. So for us, it was how do we like zoom in a little bit more and better understand our gross margin and the unit economic level. So I created a new metric around like what's our cost to deliver one unit of work, and we could track that by like the labor component, the hosting costs, annotation costs, etc. And that's now a metric that we look at in almost all of our board meetings and sort of track our ability to drive that cost down. Similarly, like what's our margin by product SKU? This is where having a good chart of accounts and like your accounting team can really drive a lot of value in helping you like disaggregate all these different components and how are you going to attribute the cost of headcount or this or that by the different pieces by unit. Another one is like cost per page. So we end up having to like annotate millions of pages of documents, and how do we try to drive that cost down? So this was another metric that we would look in, but this is sort of like a triple click of like, oh, your gross margin and this and like each of the drivers. So this has been helpful. And now like hosting costs is going up, right? Because we have some humans in the loop that help us with annotation or the legal drafting. And now we're, trying to see like, how much more can we use, AI only to drive some of this. So, how are the models performing against one another? How are these costs sort of move in unison or against one another? So all this stuff is just sort of like where is the topic today that the board is caring about, and how can you sort of like drive in deeper and deeper to get insight on the drivers.
Nice, and it's good that we're talking about margins in some way. So like not only the PE folks are caring about profitability. I'm gonna start with some audience questions. So expect to sprinkle around different topics. I'm gonna start with one that is more like shorter. That is, how does your team decide which members or who within the leadership team should join the board meetings, or for which sections, if you have a format where some people join for only part of it?
Yeah, for us, we have everybody on our SLT or ELT, whatever you call it at your company, join for what we call the open session. That allows us to all kind of be together, everyone to get that exposure to the board members and be there to answer questions or be participating in the live discussion, which can often span multiple departments and multiple, functional areas. We do then run a closed session when we need to, both because we have board observers that are not like full board members that may not necessarily need to be in all the conversations, and because we don't necessarily need the entire like senior leadership team for some of the closed session topics, things like equity grants, or if there's like sensitive legal or employee issues that need to be discussed.
And there you stay with like CEO and board members and yourself? Yep,
it's and usually our COO and head of legal as well come to that.
Makes sense. And the similar composition, different from your end?
So on this, I would always say it's like CEO's discretion who should attend. Some CEOs will be in Chris's camp and say like, hey, exec leadership team, I want everyone to attend all the time. Other times, I think it's like a distraction if they're not just bringing the people who are presenting. I've also, when I was in venture, some of the companies where I attend board meetings, they would just bring in, that sales leader just for that 30 minutes to present on sales and, have them in and out. So I think it depends, and you can ask your board members too. And their opinions generally are kind of all over the place as well. So one, what's the story you're telling that quarter? If you're going to talk about the product roadmap, product leader is going to be there. If you're not talking about HR stuff and HR isn't relevant, you might not need your people leader in that meeting. So I'd say what does the content dictate? Who should be in the meeting? Bring those folks, and then double check with your CEO. Do they want them to attend the whole meeting? Do they want them to be in and out? Do they want any other folks on the team just to get that exposure and attend? I've seen it in many ways. There's no single way to do it, but talk to your board, talk to your CEO, and find what works for you.
Nice. And did you do in-person or remote meetings in general at EvenUp?
Yeah, so right now we're doing every other is in person. So one remote, one in person. Most of our leadership team, I guess we're a little all over the place, but we got a bunch of folks in SF, and all of our VCs are in SF. So typically, it is just in San Francisco, which is pretty convenient for me because I'm also in the Bay Area.
Nice. I'm gonna jump on another one of setting expectations for the board. There's a question around how do you proactively set expectations so that they challenge you in a productive way? I think part of that will come from the pre-read, right? And setting the stage, but any other advice that comes to mind, and yeah, you want them to challenge you. You also wanna set expectations clearly.
So on setting expectations, I'd say you're probably not setting expectations in the pre-read, right? You probably set expectations in the board meeting prior to this, where you said, hey, we're going to hit XYZ target on go-to-market, and we're going to hit profitability this quarter. If you don't hit profitability that quarter and you miss the target, you've already set expectations, and you're going to have to deal with it because that's where you set the expectations in your forecast. So they challenge you in a productive way, I think, is actually it's a slightly different question, which could be, do you have a very combative board member? Which hopefully you don't, but you can't control this once they've joined the board, you're sort of stuck with them. If you have someone who you think is disruptive in the board meeting or is challenging the company, the CEO in an unproductive way, which interpret that however you want. That might be something where you have your CEO talk with them before the board meeting and say hey, I want this to be productive. If you do have these types of concerns, don't say that, voice them in a different way, or talk to me in the closed session afterwards. And I don't want the rest of my executive team to hear this type of stuff. So if you think there's something that's actually unproductive and bad that's happening in the board meeting, try to have your CEO deal with that outside of the board meeting and try to correct that behavior. And then, expectations are going to be around your forecast and things you've discussed with the board in advance, maybe your last fundraise materials. So that's what I think.
Yeah, I think going along with it, making sure that any good or any bad news or anything unexpected should probably be a conversation before the board meeting. You don't really want to surprise the board with anything in the board meeting, because that can lead to unproductive conversations. So once you kind of control for that, you can drive really productive conversations by showing responsiveness, willingness to take what you learned in the board meeting and do something about it. So maybe that's ensuring that an idea that comes up gets some analysis behind it. Maybe it's actually going to implementation on stuff, but taking kind of the outputs of the board meeting and you weaving those into the next time you talk to the board, either one-on-one or in the next board meeting, really helps show that you're learning from these and that they're a productive experience for everybody. And we'll continue bringing them back to the table to help contribute.
Nice. Switching gears a bit, we have two questions here that are related to fundraising, which is related to board, it's something we'll discuss in board meetings when it comes time. I think the first one is, as a finance leader, what's your involvement during fundraising? And here, Ali wanted to specifically hear about negotiating term sheets and like liquidation preference, participation, anti-dilution protection. And Ali's case is like, especially when it's a new lead investor.
I think a lot of
So
it
how,
depends on who, like, depends on your relationship with CEO, right? If you have an experienced CEO who's done a lot of fundraising before, they may want to lead those negotiations because they may have, preferences for how things are structured. They may have relationships. On the flip side, if your CEO is maybe not as experienced at fundraising or you're a relatively early company, finance may play a larger role in that. I think the biggest thing to do as a finance leader is making sure that we keep kind of a finger on the pulse of the market. I have a lot of conversations with other CFOs and VPs of finance so that I can see what they're seeing in the market. I talk to the investment bankers at our bank, and I talk to people at like VC firms that are just friends of mine, right? And that way you can always sort of get a feel for what the market's doing and how it's moving, so that you can bring a voice of reason or a voice of experience into that room. But at the end of the day, you really got to lean on how your CEO wants to run that process.
Andy, what's your situation?
Specific to term sheets. So I actually have quite a bit of experience with term sheet. At the venture fund I was at, I basically like wrote all of our term sheets and we would negotiate them. So I feel like I'm particularly knowledgeable in this from past experience. So on this stuff, I will give the term sheet a first pass. I will also send it to our lawyers. I'll tell my CEO like my basically comments on the term sheet, what I think is like good or not good. We've been fortunate to have like pretty like vanilla terms on all of our rounds. It's not necessarily the case, especially if yours maybe performance isn't as good as you wanted it to be in that quarter or two before your fundraise. But this is where you lean on counsel, right? We have Goodwin Proctor. They've been a great counsel for us, and those folks, they're doing rounds every week, right? So those guys know what's market. They know they've debated the exact same terms on every term sheet every month with probably the same counterparties. So this is where you can sort of lean on them and say like, hey, like, where are you seeing on this? What are, how do we push back on some like ROFO or ROFR or like whatever people are pushing on to have some special term. But at the end of the day, like my CEO, he's going to be the one who's going to negotiate directly with the venture partner that we're talking to, because that's the relationship they're going to have. So, here I sort of act as an advisor, give my opinion, make sure we're connected with counsel, we're getting good advice all around, and then CEO is gonna take the cake on negotiating.
Wearing the CEO hat, I appreciate not having to read the terms. So I would take any help that finance can give me in like reading through the term sheet. Not my favorite part of the job. Another one around fundraising is around, we have a specific question that reads, we're gearing up to raise a Series B next summer. How do you utilize board meetings to get your investors to rally around you, and do we have to activate the VC whisper networks? So do you use board member meetings or existing VCs for that, and if so, what's the best way or advice here for the audience?
Yeah, I'll answer this. So this is a great topic for a board meeting, right? This is the business that the VCs are in, right? You're going to run your board meeting. You're going to talk about, oh, gross margins changed by 30 basis points. Our product roadmap is staying the same. Things got delayed by a quarter. And then you'll say, but we're thinking about fundraising. Here's our strat. Everyone's eyes are going to light up because now they can be active in the board meeting. They're experts on this, and they're going to give you all their opinions. So now it's like, okay, great. You got their attention. They're going to give you their opinions. They might say, hey, you need another quarter. You should go now. This is what I'm seeing, etc. So one, you're going to want to have their feedback on financial performance. Like, is this the right time to go out? Are they seeing deals being, completed for companies with a similar financial profile as you at that stage? And if you think it's the right time, now it's like, how do you try to build FOMO in the round, right? Who's going to be a good person to lead? Can your VCs get you intros to the types of funds that lead these rounds and to the right partner? And can you get that meeting and be ready? So a lot of this is, to run a good fundraise process, you got to understand, like, when you're going to market, who are the folks you're going to meet with. You want to get them all lined up around a similar timeline so you can start to get some FOMO. If someone's giving you a term sheet, you can kind of accelerate the rest of the folks around that. So I think this is a great time to leverage your board. If you're at the Series A stage, your board might not be that big. Maybe you have your seed investor or Series A investor only. So, this is where, you're going to want to figure out the right funds, who you're going to get introed to, and make sure you're ready to go once those intros come in. So, like, you got your story, you got your board, you got your materials, data room, you're like prepped and ready to go.
Thanks. Chris, you mentioned, again, one of the roles that you see as well is like having that pulse in the market, but anything in terms of like, how you use that pulse to introduce the topic in board meetings or pose those questions?
Yeah, I think, I would say that our board is kind of always constantly thinking about it, and it's always a discussion, right? Pre 2022, the question was always like, is now an okay time to raise? Like, should we go ahead and get some more money now? Like, here's the couple milestones we've hit. Like, should we go ahead and do it? Kind of post 2022 things have been a little bit more unique, I think. Like, the VC market has changed quite a bit. Valuations aren't quite as frothy. And so now it becomes more of a constant conversation with your board, right? It's like, how are we managing our runway? When are our strategic opportunities to raise? And like, how are we progressing against those milestones? So it becomes less of like framing the question or getting your VCs on board to champion it, and more of like just an open dialogue. So for us, that's really helped us to kind of continue to get extra macro environment and VC market information, and really set us up for like doing our growth planning and investment strategies ways that we believe will set us up for the most optionality in the future.
Makes sense. I think we'll have time for one more question. So I see a couple that we might not get to. We might get your takes, Chris and Andy, offline, and then send them to people for that one or two. But I wanted to end with this second one from Ali of, outside of having a mentor or manager, where do you go to learn, skills that are critical for an executive finance leader, other than coming to our next LF webinars? What are some like book resources, communities that you like to leverage?
That's a good one. I don't read a lot of like, I feel like it's so like in the moment information, right? Especially in startup world and growth company world, like things can change all the time. And so like books are probably not where I generally go. They don't change fast enough. But, find a blog you like or a podcast you like. There's tons of them out there. I'm sure we could curate a list after this if we wanted to. So just build your network, right? So continue to meet new people, talking to them about how they're doing things. I hadn't met Andy before this, but we'll probably continue to chat after this and share strategies as we learn more each board meeting and things like that.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think it's really just building your network, right? Like, I started off in investment banking. Now, probably like 5 of the folks who I sat right next to are now like VPs of finance or CFOs at other companies, and we keep in close touch. Sometimes your board members might want to introduce you to, CFO of another one of their portfolio companies, and you can have candid conversations with them and tell them like, hey, these are the sorts of problems I'm running into. How have you dealt with this in the past? And they can help you with that. So I've generally found reaching out to folks in my network in getting advice on any particular problem, and then the rest is just practice, right? If you think you're not good at making slides, like try to spend more time making slides and look at ones that you think are really good, compare that, get better at telling the story. If you think you need to practice, public speaking, like just find more opportunities to present stuff internally and, you know, build that muscle and you build your confidence. So I think all of this, a lot of this stuff is just practice. You just get better each quarter as you do it again and run into novel situations.
All right. We're about in time, so I think, yeah, I wanted to end. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Chris, for being part of our first LF webinar. Thank you, everyone in the audience. I see people started to trickle out now, but you know, people stayed throughout. So it seems like Andy and Chris, you were entertaining and you said interesting stuff. So thanks a lot. And yeah, we want to make a series out of these and start doing more webinars. So we'll reach out later in the week with some questions of what you would like to see next and what are topics that we should cover. But for now, thank you, everyone, and happy holidays.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Thank you.